What if the sin of Sodom was never about sex? For 2,000 years, 6 specific Bible verses have been weaponized to condemn millions. But what if it was all a translation error? From the ancient ashes of Leviticus to the brink of a modern global schism, we uncover the history they didn't teach you in Sunday school. The church is tearing itself apart. Are you ready to hear what is actually written? The ancient roots of a modern schism. The collision between Christian orthodoxy and the LGBTQ+ movement represents perhaps the single most volatile theological fracture in the history of the modern church, a schism that does not merely divide denominations but tears at the very fabric of biblical hermeneutics and anthropological definition. To understand the magnitude of this conflict, we must strip away the veneer of contemporary culture wars and descend into the dust of the ancient Near East, where the foundational texts were inscribed under skies vastly different from our own. The narrative begins not with hatred or inclusion, but with the concept of holiness, specifically within the Levitical code of the Hebrew Bible. When we approach Leviticus 18 verse 22 and 20:13, the verses most frequently weaponized in this debate, we encounter the Hebrew term toeva, traditionally translated as abomination. However, a rigorous historical analysis reveals that toeva functioned primarily as a boundary marker for ritual purity rather than a universal moral condemnation. In the context of the Holiness Code, intended to segregate the Israelites from the Canaanites and Egyptians, the prohibition against a man lying with a man as with a woman sat alongside prohibitions against eating shellfish, wearing mixed fabrics, and planting different seeds in the same furrow. The ancient mind did not conceive of sexual orientation as a psychological identity, rather, it viewed sexuality through the lens of power, procreation, and purity. The act was condemned because it blurred the distinct categories of creation and, in the patriarchal mindset of the Iron Age, involved one male surrendering his dominant status to adopt the passive role of a woman, which was viewed as a shameful degradation of masculine honor, not necessarily a violation of love. Parallel to the legal codes stands the narrative shadow of Sodom and Gomorrah, a story that has been culturally ossified as the ultimate divine judgment against homosexuality. Yet, for thousands of years, the primary interpretation of Genesis 19 had little to do with sexual orientation. The prophet Ezekiel, writing centuries after the Genesis narrative, explicitly identifies the guilt of Sodom as pride, excessive food, and prosperous ease while failing to aid the poor and needy. The attempted gang rape of the angelic visitors by the men of Sodom was an egregious violation of the ancient Near Eastern law of hospitality, a sacred obligation to protect strangers. The reduction of this complex narrative of xenophobia and violence into a singular condemnation of consensual same-sex love is a relatively modern theological development. As we transition from the Hebraic context to the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament, the landscape shifts from ritual purity to the Stoic concept of nature. The Apostle Paul's epistle to the Romans, specifically chapter 1, serves as the theological bedrock for the traditionalist position. Here, Paul describes same-sex acts as paraphysin, contrary to nature. However, historical scholarship demands we recognize that Paul was observing the sexual ethics of the first-century Roman Empire, a world where pederasty, relations between men and boys, and master-slave exploitation were rampant. There is no historical evidence that Paul or his contemporaries had any concept of loving, egalitarian, long-term same-sex unions. When Paul condemns these acts, he frames them as a result of idolatrous excess, heterosexuals who, consumed by insatiable lust, abandon their natural function to seek more exotic pleasures. The linguistic battleground thickens with the Pauline neologisms found in 1 Corinthians 6 verse 9 and 1 Timothy 1 verse 10, malakoi and arsenokoitai. These two Greek words have confounded translators for centuries. Malakoi, literally meaning soft, was a common insult in antiquity used to describe men who lacked moral discipline, were lazy, or perhaps played the passive role in sex, but it was just as often applied to heterosexual men who loved luxury too much. Arsenokoitai is even more elusive. It appears to be a compound word coined by Paul himself, combining male and bed, likely referencing the Levitical Greek translation. While traditionalists render this directly as sodomites or homosexuals, progressive scholars argue that the term referred to economic exploitation via sex, pederasty, or prostitution, arguing that mapping the modern, psychological category of homosexual identity onto these ancient texts is an anachronistic error that distorts the author's intent. Thus, the foundation of the conflict lies in a clash of hermeneutics. One side views the text as a timeless, frozen command rooted in a biological design, while the other views it as a culturally specific corrective addressing exploitation and idolatry, unrelated to the modern reality of committed same-sex relationships. This interpretative divide set the stage for the patristic era, where early church fathers, influenced heavily by Neoplatonic philosophy, began to view all sexual desire, even within marriage, as suspicious, cementing a rigorous asceticism that would eventually pathologize any non-procreative act as a rebellion against God's creative order. From natural law to the culture wars. As the fluid chaos of the early church solidified into the institutional hierarchy of the Middle Ages, the theological stance on sexuality underwent a rigid ossification, primarily through the intellectual architecture of Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. It was Aquinas who synthesized Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine to formulate the concept of natural law, a framework that would dominate Catholic moral theology for the next 800 years and deeply influence Protestant thought. Under this paradigm, every organ of the human body was assigned a divinely ordained purpose or telos, and the telos of the reproductive organs was strictly generative. Thus, any sexual act that blocked the transmission of life was not merely a violation of a rule but a metaphysical rebellion against the very structure of reality. This philosophical certainty transformed sodomy, a nebulous term that could encompass anything from heresy to political treason, into a capital crime against the state and God. The medieval ecclesiastical courts and the secular arm worked in a terrifying synchronicity, where the accusation of sodomy became a potent political weapon used to destroy the Knights Templar and silence dissidents, with the fires of the Inquisition burning away ambiguity. The Protestant Reformation, for all its dismantling of papal authority, left this sexual ethic completely untouched. Martin Luther and John Calvin viewed non-procreative sexuality with the same horror as the popes they denounced, cementing a unified Western Christian tradition that lasted well into the Victorian era. However, the 19th century brought a silent revolution that would eventually shatter this unity: the shift from theology to sexology. As the Enlightenment gave way to the scientific age, the sinner was reclassified as the patient, and the sin of sodomy was reimagined through the lens of psychology as the condition of homosexuality. While the Church initially welcomed this medical model as a way to treat rather than execute, it inadvertently planted the seeds of the modern identity crisis by acknowledging that same-sex attraction might be an innate constitution rather than a momentary demonic temptation. This uneasy truce between religion and psychiatry held until the cultural explosion of the 1960s and the Stonewall riots of 1969, which forced the Church to confront a community that was no longer whispering in the shadows but demanding recognition in the light. the reaction was an immediate and violent bifurcation of the Christian world. In 1972, the United Church of Christ ordained William R. Johnson, the first openly gay minister in a mainline denomination, signaling the birth of affirming theology which argued that justice and liberation were the core tenets of the gospel. Simultaneously, the 1970s saw the rise of the religious right in the United States, where figures like Jerry Falwell mobilized conservative evangelicals into a political voting bloc, framing the opposition to LGBTQ+ rights not just as a doctrinal stance but as a battle for the survival of civilization itself. This theological Cold War turned hot with the onset of the AIDS crisis in the 1980s, a tragedy that served as a crucible for Christian ethics. For the fundamentalist wing, the epidemic was preached as divine retribution, a modern-day Sodom narrative played out in hospital wards, solidifying a rhetoric of judgment that alienated a generation. Yet, simultaneously, in the very same cities, Catholic nuns and progressive Protestant clergy were often the only ones willing to hold the hands of the dying when medical staff refused, creating a paradox where the Church was both the loudest condemner and the primary caregiver. This era birthed the ex-gay movement, institutionalized by organizations like Exodus International, which promised that faith could rewrite sexual orientation through reparative therapy, a promise that would collapse decades later under the weight of its own failures and the recantations of its leaders. As the 20th century closed, the lines were drawn. The clobber passages were no longer just verses but political manifestos. The mainline denominations began a slow, agonizing process of revising their canons, driven by the personal testimonies of congregants and the theological argument that the fruit of the Spirit could be found in same-sex unions. Conversely, the Catholic Church and conservative evangelicals hardened their defenses, doubling down on the complementarity of the sexes as a non-negotiable truth. The stage was set for the institutional fractures of the 21st century, where the question of inclusion would cease to be a side issue and become the defining test of orthodoxy, leading to the greatest ecclesiastical realignments since the Reformation. The Great Fragmentation and the Future of Faith. We have now arrived at the precipice of the present moment, where the theological fault lines of the past century have finally given way, causing the most significant institutional collapse since the Protestant Reformation. The illusion of a unified denominational consensus has shattered, leaving behind a landscape defined by schism, litigation, and a radical realignment of Christian identity. The most visceral example of this disintegration is found in the United Methodist Church, once a titan of American mainline Protestantism known for its big tent theology. After decades of uneasy compromise, the tent finally collapsed in 2024, leading to a historic divorce where thousands of conservative congregations exited to form the Global Methodist Church, unwilling to inhabit the same ecclesiastical structure as bishops who affirm same-sex marriage. This was not merely an administrative reshuffling but a profound declaration that the two sides no longer worship the same God or read the same Bible. The schism is replicated globally within the Anglican Communion, where the bishops of the Global South, representing the exploding Christian populations of Nigeria, Uganda, and Kenya, have effectively excommunicated the Church of England and the Episcopal Church of USA. In a striking reversal of colonial power dynamics, African prelates now accuse their former Western masters of ideological neocolonialism, arguing that the West is exporting a decadent, secular sexual ethic that betrays the very gospel missionaries once brought to their shores. The rift is no longer just theological, it is geopolitical, racial, and cultural. Amidst this polarization, a nuanced and often misunderstood third way has emerged, known in theological circles as side B Christianity. Rejecting both the side A affirmation of same-sex marriage and the side XX gay conversion therapy, proponents of side B, such as the Revoice movement, occupy a space of profound ascetical tension. They acknowledge their same-sex attraction as a fixed reality but voluntarily submit to the traditional sexual ethic of celibacy, viewing their orientation not as a curse to be cured but as a unique calling to spiritual friendship and radical community building. Yet, this position finds itself homeless, attacked by progressives for internalized homophobia and suspected by conservatives of being a Trojan horse for queer theory within the Church. Simultaneously, the Roman Catholic Church, under the pontificate of Francis, has entered a period of turbulence unseen since Vatican II. The 2023 Declaration Fiducia Supplicans, which permitted the non-liturgical blessing of same-sex couples, was intended as a pastoral bridge, but instead, it ignited a firestorm of resistance. Entire conferences of bishops, particularly in Eastern Europe and Africa, openly refused to implement the Vatican's directive, a stunning act of defiance that questions the very limits of papal authority in the modern age. The Catholic Church now finds itself balancing on a razor's edge, trying to hold together the German synodal path, which pushes for radical inclusion, and the traditionalist wing, which views any concession as heresy. As we look toward the horizon, it becomes clear that the conflict over LGBTQ+ inclusion is not a temporary storm that will pass, but a permanent climate change for Christianity. The debate has revealed that the opposing sides are operating with fundamentally incompatible anthropologies. One views the human body and gender as raw material for self-expression and covenantal love, while the other views them as fixed signposts of a divine creational order. There is no synthesis possible between these two visions. The future of Christianity will likely be post-denominational in the traditional sense, defined instead by hermeneutical alliances. We will see affirming Catholics having more in common with liberal Presbyterians than with their own conservative co-religionists, while conservative Anglicans will find their true spiritual kin among Southern Baptists and Orthodox believers. The middle ground is rapidly eroding, forcing every institution, seminary, and individual believer to choose a side. In this brave new world, the question is no longer whether Christianity can accommodate the LGBTQ+ experience, but whether the Christian faith can survive its own internal war over what it means to be human. The dust has not settled, in fact, the walls are still falling.